Welcome to another Tale Researcher series sessions. So as usual, I'm Puyin, I'm your host for today. And before I introduce our guest today, I would like to introduce to you a special co-host we have who isn't a Lancaster member, but nonetheless a very amazing person. Colin, would you like to just quickly say hello to everyone?
Hello, everyone. I'm Colin Simpson. I have worked in the third space, education technology, learning design, academic development area for about 20 years at a range of universities across Australia. And I am currently focusing on my PhD, which is due in June. And that's about the third space as well.
So it is my honour to introduce the legendary Professor Peter Bryant, who held very many roles at the University of Sydney, including Associate Dean in Education, and obviously Professor of Business Education and a co-director of the Disruptive Innovations in Business Education Research Group and a fellow trustee of ALT. But most importantly, I think Peter is, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that Peter is a household name in digital education, learning technology, because of his contribution over the years in digital pedagogy and learning design, etc., etc. I'm not going to pretend I can explain Peter's work well, which is why Peter's here today to talk to us about his research. So if that's okay, I'm going to stop sharing the intro slide and hand the stage over to Peter.
Excellent. Thank you, Puyin, and thank you for the invite. And it's wonderful to see many familiar names and faces in the room, both from Australia and from the UK, which is brilliant. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I am on the unceded Indigenous lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney. The university itself is built on a site of learning that has been a site of learning for the Indigenous peoples of the Sydney Basin for 40,000 years or more. It's built at an intersection of three roads which connected the three different groups of Indigenous people in the basin area here in Sydney, the Bedegal, the Gadigal and the Warrigal, who all are connected, the Camaragal, sorry, that are all connected to Sydney through the harbour. And the university itself is built on their traditional lands. So I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging for the peoples of the lands of the University of Sydney and the lands that you yourself may be on as well. Thank you, Puyin, once again for the invitation. I thought I'd do this in a slightly different way. So firstly, just I guess to give context, I've been in higher education now as of February next year. That'll be my 30th year in higher education, despite my youthful appearance. I started as a vocational education teacher in a wonderful vocational education system here in Australia called TAFE, which stands for Technical and Further Education. I started as a computing teacher and then moved into business, and my career progressed over many different phases of academic leadership, development, ideation, innovation. I developed some of the first online learning programs in Australia in the mid-1990s through a very large group of funded projects that the New South Wales government funded. I've taken quite what I would think is probably a discursive journey through higher education and have worked both here in Australia and in the UK. I did 10 years in the United Kingdom. But at all points through that journey, I've always attempted to take a perspective of learning that was more than just student-centric, but was defined and structured through what it means to learn as a student. So what I mean by that is that for me, the experiences I had as a student long time ago were without a doubt transformative to the experiences that I am able to have now. I wouldn't be an academic. I wouldn't be a teacher. I wouldn't have any of those experiences if it wasn't for the experiences I had in my undergraduate degree. That's not to say that the undergraduate degree that I had is the exact same undergraduate degree that people doing university now should have. That's 35 years ago, I enrolled in my undergraduate degree, and I can't imagine an 18-year-old Peter Bryant being told by someone like me, an associate dean or a professor, your education is going to be exactly the same as mine. Oh, when did you do your undergraduate, professor? Oh, I did it in 1955. You know, that's not what I would have wanted to hear. If I'd heard that, I'd be going, oh, yeah, right, 1955, that was the year Elvis did it. So students today don't want to hear that from me. They don't want to hear that the experience I had is exactly the experience that I want them to have. So I'm very much, I try and immerse myself in the experiences and the voice of the students that I engage with, whether that's at the front of the classroom or engaged in being an academic, or whether that's in my current role, which is actually running projects that collect and interpret and immerse ourselves in the student experience in a much more systematic and I would say storytelling kind of way, but I'll talk about that project separately. So all through my career, student voice, student perspective, student engagement has been at the very center of it. So if you think about, I'll put my pencil away, that's really rude. I'll just stop poking my pencil around. If you think about all of that context of student engagement and student voice and understanding the way students are interacting with or against or shifting and changing and repurposing and remixing the things that we engage with them about, if you see that as data and data points, a lot of what I have done even since my very first class is research. Research has been at the heart of it. So I'll tell you a story from 1994. I was in my very first class I ever taught was in a big horticultural greenhouse, because I was working in a catering college, but it also had horticulture and agricultural studies and how to run plant nurseries and all that kind of stuff. So they had a huge greenhouse, regularly raided by the police because students grew weed in the greenhouse. So my very first class had just been interrupted by a police raid to take away about 6 horticultural students for propagation of plants that they shouldn't be propagating. And so I sat down, and of course, I didn't know how to be a teacher. I hadn't been trained. I hadn't done any grad cert, or I had my own university experience, which was not that long prior to that. I had a bit of my thinking about, because my father was a teacher, a bit of what he told me before I walked in. And so I'd written up this very, very detailed planned lesson. Lots and lots of, I'm going to talk about this and I'm going to talk about it. And the topic was Introduction to Computing. And I wrote these, and I used to have these plastic folders with plastic sleeves in them, and they were my lesson plans, and it was a very organized thing. And I walked into that class and I said, I looked around the class, and it was a very mixed, diverse class. It was a number of people who were recent migrants to the country. There was a small group who were there as refugees and had been taken in as refugees, and vocational education is part of the way that particularly the Australian government helped refugees integrate into their new country. There were some 18-year-old kids studying hospitality. It was a really diverse group. And so I'm thinking, okay, I've got to teach them computers. Right, well, what's the first thing we're going to teach? Right, well, I want you all to turn on the computer. Okay, that's That's reasonably okay. We are not talking computers that we have now. We are talking giant PCs. So there is a big button that I said, there's a big button that's got a circle and a line in it. Press that. Okay, all the computers turned on. They all logged in. None of them were connected to a network. Thankfully, I didn't have to deal with that. Turned all that stuff on. And I said, right, so we're going to learn now how to use Windows. Oh, everyone's nodding their head. That's fantastic. So firstly, get your mouse and double click on the icon for Word. Okay, that sounds pretty good. They picked up their mouse. There we go, there's my mouse, picked up my mouse. There was such diversity in that group from understanding what when you say you need to double click an icon, what that actually meant, and no, that is not a euphemism again. So when you say to someone to learn how to double click a mouse and they've never seen a mouse in their life and they have no idea how a mouse operates, just think about when you get people, they'd get the mouse and they'd be going 1, 2. I'm double clicking it, aren't I? No, you've got to do it quickly, like 1, 2. Oh, like 1, 2. No, even like it's a hard skill to learn, to teach someone how to do. And then I started listening to the student voice. There were 18-year-old kids in there that had been using computers at school. They knew exactly what they're doing. They were bored out of their skulls. There were migrants who, why do you call this white little box with a lead a mouse? I have no idea. Oh, it looks like a mouse. Oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. But they'd never used one before. You had others who had only ever had computers shown to them, but never used them because the school they were at had one computer and the teacher used it and the teacher just showed them how to use it, or maybe put up a overhead projector slide of a computer. There was such variation in that room. And as a person who never taught, had no idea what was going on and never learned any of these things, it freaked me out without a doubt. And just for some reason, my natural instinct was to start asking them questions. Okay, who in the room here has ever used a computer? Who in the room here has ever used a mouse? And then I just started pairing them up. Okay, I've got you 6 are really expert at this. Can you go and sit with that group over there at the computers? And just, I don't know what, and I can't, I mean, we're talking 30 years ago, so I may be misremembering this, but I definitely remember I thought, what is the best way to teach people how to use a mouse? And I got them to all open up the computer game Solitaire. Because Solitaire, as a game on Windows, required you to double click, drag and drop, and single click. And actually, it had a right click function as well, because you could right click and look at the card. So it actually did all of the basic mouse functions you needed it to know. So what the students told me, the student voice, the perspectives they gave me, all of that stuff became a very interesting way in which I could shape my teaching going forward. Do I think that was research? No. Do I think I was doing good teaching? Definitely not. Do I think that it shaped my journey as a researcher? 125% it did. Because for me, at the very heart of what I do as an educational researcher is the notion that the student experience, the student journey is deeply liminal. It is deeply often unsettling for students. It's highly uncertain because the outcomes are still yet to have happened. Graduation is often 3 years away. How you'll use the knowledge and skills and experience that you gain in university might be 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the track. It's deeply uncanny for the students. The experiences of higher education, which are often driven by sort of a sense of abstractness. So the ideas of the way we use case studies, the way we develop problem sets, the way we give people exemplars to use in class, they're often quite abstracted from the experiences that the students have had and perhaps will ever have. I come from a business school. We use hundreds, if not thousands, of Harvard University case studies every year. They are deeply abstracted from the student experience. They're often about weapons manufacturers and companies that they don't even know and don't operate outside of the US. But academics choose those case studies, and that gives a real sense of uncanniness to the student experience. And that my kind of understanding of how that emerged and my understanding of where students' transition started from one social state to another emerged very much from that first class that I had. And it was reinforced all the way through my first 2 years of teaching, where I was teaching 25 hours a week. I had classes that I was teaching the most boring subject you've ever heard in your life. Can you imagine a subject where you have 20 hours of learning based around how you design a printed form? So what fields go into a printed form for stock control? What fields go into a printed form to manage HR? It was a form designing class. Students were bored out of their skulls. And so how did I make that interesting? I had to listen to what the students, I didn't have to listen to how bored they were. They made it pretty clear. So I drew in the fact that actually they do need to know this stuff. This stuff's really valuable. You may not need to know how to design a form, but you might need to know that the form isn't suitable for your purposes. And it might need to actually that, particularly if you're keeping compliance or record keeping that are required by law, understanding this stuff's actually quite important. So how do you change the context? I brought in somebody who used forms that they were designing every day. And this was a senior person running their own business, a big hotel, and he explained exactly why these forms are important. But I had to hear from the students. That student voice, that student uncertainness and liminality had to be at the center of what I was doing. And that journey is now very central to every piece of research I do. And that could be research that's about strategic development of higher education. It could be about the use of technology. It's often heavily important in the way in which I talk about and describe the student experience and the way students engage in teaching and learning and assessment. And then that feeds really closely into some of the work that I do around how the nexus between research and teaching practice. So that's the kind of early piece where that all came from. I did a bit of research while I was working in vocational education. It's not really a fundamental part of what we do in vocational education, but it is a thing that I do from a very reflexive perspective that as a teaching practitioner. So, okay, I'll start with an important part of where that notion of reflexivity comes from. When I did do formal teacher education, I was very taken by the notion of critical reflection. I thought critical reflection was a really important thing. I got it. I didn't like the metaphors that a lot of the literature used around the reflective mirror. I found that a little bit hard to sort of get my head around. Not so much hard to get my head around, it just seemed a bit naff to me as I was thinking through it. But one of the author who did a lot of work on the reflective mirror is a guy called Stephen Brookfield. I don't know if anyone's ever read of any of Brookfield's work on critical reflection. But he wrote this amazing article that I found in 1997 called The Dark Side of Critical Reflection. And that immediately tapped into something for me, that this isn't all about positivism and all about the kind of that everything in education goes right. This is how we kind of interpret our own insecurities and uncertainties about what it means to be a teacher. And he, in that article, talked a lot about this idea of what makes us critique our own teaching, what makes us think about why something has failed. And the simplest example of that is he kind of wrapped a lot of this around this notion of that a lot of academics believe that they are imposters, that whilst often students who are in transition into different professional capacities believe that they're imposters, and there's a certain sense of imposter syndrome there, we as academics equally ourselves sometimes feel like we're imposters. And particularly where we're teaching a subject that we've not taught before, or a subject that we really struggle with, or a subject that we're just lacking the kind of epistemological confidence of the whole subject, because we're developing it week by week by week by week. And he talks about a number of these different types of triggers for us to, as academics, to think about these are the frames that we should be reflecting in, because often reflection is reflection on why did this not work for the students. But there's also an element of why did it didn't work for us and therefore didn't work for the students. And it made me once again start to get very deeply critical, if you will, of what my own practice meant in the light of the practices of our students. So I'll tell two things here that I think are interesting. One of the worst teachers I ever had in my life. I won't name names, but she was one of the worst teachers I ever had in my life. It was in my undergraduate degree. It was an absolutely horrendous teaching experience. It was learning marketing strategy. We were stuck, granted, in a horrible space, and it does prove the importance of space to the quality of a teaching experience. We were stuck in this room with no windows. It was I don't know what it was, but there was 50 of us in a room for 40 with no windows in Sydney summer coming into, so it would have been the January, February, it would have been the February. And she gave us this set of readings, this readings book, which was 1,000 pages of articles that she'd just photocopied and shoved into the book. And then each week she would say, I want you to pick 10 articles and read them. And then she would pick 10 articles. And if you were one of the people that picked the 10 articles that she picked, you had to then go and engage in a discussion. And all the rest of us who didn't read that article just sat there and listened. It was horrible. There was no narrative to it. There was no structure to it. And I've always, when I teach teachers, I give a very long version of that story when I talk about lesson planning, and I talk about the notion of constructive alignment, and I talk about the notions of integrating your own research and your own thinking into the way you do teaching and learning, the teaching learning nexus. And it's a kind of a linked story that goes on for about an hour. So I've always bagged the absolute crap out of this teacher to public audiences, and I'm doing it again. I bumped into this person about 6 or 7 years ago. I was sitting down with my old PhD supervisor. We were just catching up, having a chat. And she brought this person over and said, oh, Peter, this is such and such. Oh, I remember you. I don't know if you would remember, but you taught me in 1990, it must have been. Yeah, it would have been 1990. You taught me in 1990. And she goes, oh, were you in my marketing strategy class? And I said, yeah, oh, that's the one. I was in your marketing strategy class. And her head went into her hands like this, and she's like, I am so embarrassed. That was the worst class I've ever taken in my life. I knew nothing about the area. She said, I'm an expert in international marketing. I've never taught marketing strategy before. They gave it to me the day before and said, go and do it. So she just threw a whole lot of stuff that she had, that people had given her, and in a filing cupboard, and magazines were on her desk, and textbooks she could pull off her shelf. She just threw them into this book and said, this'll do. And she literally each week just walked into the class not knowing what to teach, not understanding the structure of the unit, the learning outcomes, not understanding how her very deep knowledge, her very deep research about international marketing could really inform marketing strategy in quite an engaged way. She couldn't see any of that. All she could see was the sheer panic of walking into a room and being an imposter. So Brookfield's article to me is one of those pivotal pieces that ever since then, I've become deeply fascinated by liminality and deeply fascinated by how students journey through and often reside in liminality. So my PhD, which I did many years ago, is not actually in education. My PhD is in arts management, of all things. I have been a arts and creative practitioner since I was very young. I used to run and manage school discos when I was 12. At 15, I started bringing bands to my school to raise money for the school. For the Australians in the audience who are old enough to remember, one of the bands I brought to the school in the mid-80s was the Dynamic Hypnotics, who had a very big hit with Soul Kind of Feeling. I did that. Thank you, Colin. At least someone remembers them. And then as I got into university, I started doing community radio. So I ran community radio shows for best part of 20 years. I did a improvised political comedy show, which ran for 15 years, won numerous awards. So I've always done creative practice. So when I started thinking about my PhD, I ended up writing about this type of do-it-yourself art called zines. Zines are independently produced magazines. They were very popular in the punk movement in the 1970s. They were very popular in the fandom of particularly Star Trek, but a whole lot of science fiction in the 1970s. And they were absolutely pivotal to the Riot Girl movement, or the third wave feminist movement of the 1990s that came out of Seattle and Portland in the United States, or in the Pacific Northwest. And I found them really fascinating forms of art because they are disruptive, they break copyright, they're often cut and paste with images, then they're hand photocopied and they're distributed by hand. But what I also really liked about them was that the people who made them didn't want to be journalists. They didn't want to make magazines. They didn't want to work for newspapers. They actually just wanted to talk about fandom, but they also wanted to talk about body dysmorphia, gender issues, abuse, a whole range of incredibly difficult topics that they had nowhere else to share that. So they shared their stories through zines. I just found that absolutely fascinating. And as a person who likes that kind of intersection of art and humanity and creation and trauma and hope and all of that kind of beautifully complex mess that is the human existence, zines were just a perfect encapsulation of it. And they're brilliant. And actually, from an education perspective, a lot of people use zines in classroom teaching. It's actually really a common method to try and get people into journaling and diarising and that kind of stuff. So my whole PhD is about why do people make zines? And what at the very core of that PhD is the idea of why do people make zines? They make zines because they're liminal, because it's a liminal state. It's how they make sense of transitioning from one social structure to another. And what the thesis and then subsequent publications that I've done since then theorized was the idea that people who are liminal come together. They come together in what anthropologists refer to as a communitas. And a communitas is a community of liminal folk. And this idea that when you're transitioning, when you're moving from one social structure to another, and all the uncertainty and worry and fear that you have as you just don't feel, I think the word they often use in philosophy is you feel unhomely. You just don't have a sense of feeling comfortable. And anthropologists talk about that as uncertainty, but philosophers will talk about it as unhomeliness. Liminal thinkers think about it as just part of the journey, the notion of the journey, and the rite of passage that is. And that's the other critical part of this, that kind of journey is like a rite of passage, that you seek others who are feeling the same way. And you form this communitas of people that come together. I found that absolutely fascinating. And that notion of a communitas, of uncanny, uncertain, liminal people all journeying, coming together to be very representative of education. What it's like in a first year class, what it's like in the first time you step into a classroom in whatever you're doing, undergraduate, postgraduate, doctoral studies, whatever. First time you step into that classroom, you don't know the people in the room, and you feel a real sense of that sense of being unhomely, that sense of being uncomfortable, that uncertainty. And it can be quite represented by the knot in the stomach, or the sweat, or the way you change your eye patterns to not look at anybody. Because if I look at someone might look at me and talk at me. So you kind of, and we do it now, particularly with laptops and with phones, the way we kind of avoid direct eye contact in those circumstances. And gradually, as you realize the people in the room are perhaps experiencing some of the same emotions you're feeling, that sense of association, what in the literature and what I refer to as associative commonality, that you find a common space through association, and that's how a communitas forms. So I found that a really interesting frame to understand the student experience through. And as I moved into teaching in higher education in the UK, I was a work-based learning academic at Middlesex. I became an educational developer at the University of Greenwich, and then I led learning technology and innovation at the London School of Economics. And in all of those contexts, that notion of what brings students together in a group, how they can engage in connected learning, how connection can not just be the thing that triggers learning at the point it's happening, but how it can give learning a resonance and actually something that lasts past the immediate learning experience, the transactional nature of the immediate learning experience. All that thinking about communitas and zines really fell right into that. And I think what I got out of that, and this is something that I find really interesting as a researcher, that has nothing to do with education. Communitas, liminality, is an anthropological concept. And my good friend, Dr. Donna Longclow, who's my favorite anthropologist to hang out with, primarily because I like going to the pub with her. But, when I first told her that I was writing about liminality and communitas and rite of passage and whatever else, her brain exploded a little bit, because that's her discipline area. But then I'm also writing about media and understanding the way media works, because zines are media, they're a form of media. And then I was writing about participation and the idea, it's from a sociological perspective, why people participate in social movements and understanding the way social movements work. And then finally, I'm writing about punk, and I'm writing about the importance of punk music, which is right into my safe space, but also writing about the intersections of punk and politics, because third wave feminism and Riot Girl, which is effectively female-led punk from the 1990s, was in part a reaction to the fact that the British punk movement of the 1970s was not exclusively, but was primarily male-driven, and was had become quite aggressively male. And bands like Bikini Kill and Bratmobile and a whole heap of others on the Kill Rock Stars label in the Pacific Northwest in the US took that as like, well, we need to own that ourselves, and we need to re-own words that are used against us as slurs, and own those as empowering words for us as progressive young feminists, and then progressive young activists in terms of gay and lesbian and trans issues. And then it became this massive empowering world that was triggered by music. That's 4 separate fields, and that's what a PhD almost always does. It drags in these transdisciplinary fields. But then the real critical skill is, how do you keep the momentum of that transdisciplinarity impacting on your research? So I'm going to talk briefly about where this now ends up, because I'm mindful of time. So I'm going to talk about where this ends up. My most recent research here at the University of Sydney has been about the idea of leadership. I'm really interested in leadership education. I'm really interested in management education, but I'm particularly interested in the challenges of teaching leaders. Because when you talk about leadership education, it's very hard to think about it in the abstract, because leadership is context driven. You know, it's that idea that good leaders are born, not bred. Where does leadership come from? Is it an inherent trait that you have? Is it something that can be taught? It's a very complex field. And then you throw into the fact that in business schools, a lot of what we do is driven by government policy that arises from the sort of neoliberal marketized institutions that we work for, which says business schools generate the revenue, business schools are teaching factories, business schools produce people who go and work for the major consulting firms and accounting firms, business schools teach neo-fascists. So all of those kind of things fit into the way in which curricula is expected to be designed. And leadership is the classic one for that. So I run a program here at the University of Sydney called Leading in a Post-Crisis World. It's got about 4,000 students in it every year. And in that program, we try and not teach leadership, but teach what it means to lead, what it means to be a leader. What is the verb leading? Or what does that mean? And in that unit, there's lots of stuff around students thinking about their leadership legacy and thinking about how they get to a world that, without we don't go too deeply into Thomas More's idea of utopia, but how do we get to a utopian world where we are post-crisis, where there's no such thing as a crisis, where we're not constantly reacting to crisis, and we can actually be free of the kind of constant pinballing of reaction. And we also add a lot of capability for students to develop solutions to critical, global, local, and personal challenges. And they do that collectively. Interesting unit. We really like it. It has got a lot of institutional purposes, but It is about developing leaders for good. But I was really interested in the fact that one of the units we run 4 units in this program. One of them is for our undergraduate students. And we were getting first year students doing it. It's meant to be a second year unit, but we're getting first year kids picking it up. These are kids straight out of school, 18-year-olds going into their first university semester, and they're picking up a unit called Leading in a Post-Crisis World. Now, I've never bought the argument that students are empty vessels. Students bring a very rich set of lived and living experiences to their education. They are varied in level, varied in understanding, varied in application, but everybody brings years of life experience. It's just different to the life experience of the teacher. And so often that gets misrepresented, I think, by not great teachers, but it gets misrepresented as a student is empty vessel and I'm there to fill it up. So I was thinking, we've got these 18-year-old students coming in with these varied experiences, and because this unit is delivered across the entire university, it's people from vet science, it's people from art, from film studies, it's people from architecture and design, it's people from business, it's all over the shack. So I was really interested in, how do we teach leadership to students who may not use those skills for 10 or 15 years? Because our curricula in that neoliberal marketized environment is still very driven about preparing students for their first job, for the first graduate job, which they're probably not going to be a leader in. So it got me thinking about that journey. And what did I come back to? Liminality. Back to this uncertainty, this transitional state. So I did a bit of research and a bit of thinking, and I came across some wonderful work that comes from 1955, a researcher called D.W. Winnicott. And D.W. Winnicott researched the way, not even children, he researched the way babies learn. And he talked about, how do we understand how a brand newborn baby becomes a toddler, becomes an infant, becomes a young child, all of which happens in 3, 4, 5 years, depending on how you want to view those ages. Their development is rapid. They change physically, mentally, and intellectually at such a rapid pace. 1 year of their life at 3 is effectively a third of their life. There's so much, variation in development of children. Anyone who's got children knows they vary at different paces, and they walk at different times, and they talk at different times, and they learn things at different times. And Winnicott was really interested in that transition. So Winnicott posited this idea of what he called transitional space. And transitional space was where learning happened with real skills, real experiences, but with a safety net on, with the fact that it's not going to be, I hate to use this word real, but it's not going to be the real thing. It's just going to be the development that they go through. And the image that he used, the kind of signifier that he used, was the teddy bear. So let me tell you the teddy bear stages. The teddy bear stage for a newborn is tactile. A teddy bear is just something that oh, that's a feeling I didn't have in the womb. It's all about the way the teddy bear feels. The parents moving the teddy bear and bouncing around. Look at the teddy move. That is all stimulus that a newborn has never seen. He then talked about the next stage, where the teddy bear gets an emotional connection. The child can't articulate that emotional connection. They can't talk about it, but the child, when the parents go, "Oh, look at Ted," the child knows when you say Ted, that's what they're talking about, that object. The teddy bear is something that helps them. They can't go to sleep unless the teddy bear's in the cot with them. There's an emotional connection, but they don't know what it means. And the teddy bear is that kind of space in which those emotions are developing. The next stage of child development, the teddy bear has identity. The name of the teddy bear is important to the child. The child is inventing the story of the teddy bear, what the teddy bear is saying to it as an invisible friend. All of those kind of habits and those kind of tools of learning are things that make the teddy bear really valuable. And then as each stage of the child's life progresses, the teddy bear develops further and further away from the child, but the teddy bear never goes away because the experiences that were had with that teddy bear resonate here. And what I find fascinating is that as a 53-year-old man, when my mum was cleaning out her house, she found my teddy bear. It was also my brother's teddy bear, so it's a really old teddy bear. It's got no eyes, no fur. Mum said, "Oh, do you want to keep this?" I didn't hesitate to say yes. That teddy bear is now on a shelf with important objects in my house. My wife and I call the teddy bear Blind Ted because it's got no eyes. And Blind Ted, we just make up that Blind Ted is the wisest thing on the planet, because Blind Ted has lived for 60 years and seen all these things, and all Blind Ted says things like, wisdom comes from not actually seeing, and comes up with all these kind of, truisms. My brother, who's 11 years older than me, just had his birthday a few weeks ago. My mum put up a photo of him when he was 3. He was holding Blind Ted in 1962. He was holding Blind Ted in 1962. Blind Ted had fur, and I could not tell you, once I saw Blind Ted with all of the fur, all of those experiences I remember as a child, not in detail, but all came back. The teddy bear represents part of a journey. So I started thinking about what were the things that in an educational experience about leadership would have the same emotional effect. And it's not sitting doing an exam. It's not doing a quiz on an LMS. It's actually not the technology. It's the experience. And if that experience is shared, that doubles the power of that experience. Now, Blind Ted was the thing I shared those experiences with. And that was one of the connections that I made. So it made us start to think about the way we redesigned the program, and actually made the program a series of experiences that built connection, that encouraged students to engage with each other, that were actually really challenging and difficult. They were actually not simple. They were actually emotional. They were actually sometimes even traumatic. Sometimes really challenged them ethically, or challenged their belief structures. And sometimes were really quite difficult for them to navigate. But that's how they learned leadership. And then 5, 10, 15 years later, those experiences will be the things that will come back to them when they're having to remember how to be a leader in a crisis. So throughout that whole journey, from teaching young refugee kids scared out of their wits in a new country with a language they didn't understand, faced with this small piece of white plastic with a white cable coming out of it going, I have no idea what this is, to the next generation of leaders coming out of the University of Sydney Business School, going into, you know, finance companies, going into banks, going into retail industries, going into government, going into community groups. The common thread remains that education is a journey, and education is not a linear journey. Education is a very discursive, you know, up, down, left, right, all over the shack journey. And to finish off, this is something which I think is actually very deeply embedded in Indigenous knowledge. So at the very heart of the University of Sydney strategy is this notion that we want First Nations knowledge, Indigenous people's knowledge, to be very deeply embedded in how we deliver education. The two processes that usually follow on from that are either decolonising the curricula, so removing a lot of the colonial privileging in the curricula, but then I actually think the more important part of that is indigenising the curriculum, bringing Indigenous knowledge into it. And that notion of linearity, and that notion of that a journey is not a straight line, is often best represented by, in a lot of Australian Indigenous culture, by the notion of the rainbow serpent. It's a story you can look up. It's a very common Indigenous story. It actually crosses a number of the 280 plus different Indigenous communities and cultures that are here in Australia. But the notion of the rainbow serpent is very much about how knowledge and how the generations of souls and spirits and knowledge comes together in what a number of the Australian Indigenous communities refer to as the dream time. It's a sort of period in their history where knowledge and experience and life come together, and then that gets orally passed down through generation to generation to generation, adapted, changed, added to, all of those kind of things. So have a look up the notion of the dream time and the rainbow serpent. I've probably not done it any real justification in the time I've got, but it's a really important thing to see learning as a journey and to see it as a non-linear journey, because that's where students are coming from, and that's where we end up. So I want to finish on one very brief little story. Some of you may have heard this before. There's a wonderful bird here in Australia called the sulphur-crested cockatoo. It's a gorgeous bird, loud as all hell, very present in the urban areas. It's a white cockatoo with a sulphur-crested crown, hence sulphur-coloured crown. That's why it's called sulphur-crested cockatoo. We're pretty literal in this country. We have a bird called the galah. It's called the galah because its call sounds like like its name. It's Australia. So the sulphur-crested cockatoo used to work in regional areas, trees. It used to eat nuts and stuff like that. Moves into urban areas, can't get food. It taught itself to go into the giant bins, and instead of using its claw to dig like this and its beak to break things, it learnt to turn its claw that way and lift a bin lid up to as high as it could get its claw. Then it was able to get its beak and actually fly with its beak with the lid to flip open the lid of a bin. And what was inside the bin? Tasty food, tasty morsels. Who needs to eat seeds off the trees when you can eat last night's chicken? Perfect. That's exactly what the bird did. That sounds wonderful. One bird taught itself to do that. You talk to anyone who's a bird biomechanic expert, they tell you that is one of the most insanely evolutionary, almost impossible skills to do, but it did it. Fantastic. That bird taught every other damn sulphur-crested cockatoo how to do that. didn't just hold it to itself, it taught everybody. Because it had worked out something that it wanted to share. And it shared it with every other sulphur-crested cockatoo. And it's amazing now when you see them as a flock, now not just go, one of them try to lift a lid, you get like 6 or 7 of them all trying to lift their lids and open it up and flip it over and eat the tasty morsels. And the cool thing is that has meant they can adapt and not just survive in urban areas, but thrive. There's now more of them than there ever has been. And they are such, to me, so important to the urban areas of the country, to see those birds, to see them survive and thrive. And I think that's a really good example of learning as it evolves. And it's not linear. Like, that only happened because circumstance X meant that they were in a particular uncertain similar situation. Are birds like them liminal? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure I want to ascribe liminality to birds. I struggled sometimes to ascribe liminality, and the way it's often used in literature and research, to all humans. But I can definitely struggle to subscribe it to a bird. Are they liminal? Meh. Were they on a journey from one social structure to another? Yes, they were. Were they uncertain as to their future? Yes, they were. Yet they learnt and shared in their community. And I think that's exactly what we need to do. We as humans and as higher education researchers, we just need to be more cockatoo. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much. Thanks, Peter. I was wondering if I could ask you, I was going to ask you a question about your experiences of educational research, but after what you said about 10 minutes ago, I wonder if this is even about educational research. But clearly technology is wrapped around a lot of what you do, and so is a focus on getting the best from people. That clearly comes through from the way you speak, and it was great. Have you got any thoughts or experiences on how we can kind of balance this tension, I suppose, in helping people to get the most from technology and navigating liminality, whilst also avoiding succumbing to a kind of technological fix when struggling with liminality? And by technology, yeah, I don't just mean digital devices. I mean all the great things that you spoke about, like, zines and social media and imagery and anything that's not a natural system, essentially. I know it's an awfully clumsy question, but I wonder if you've got any thoughts that could help us with that.
Yeah, I do. And I think one of the things that one of the very first pieces of research I did while I was at the LSE was a project called LSE 2020. And it was collecting 100 digital stories from students about the way they engage with the use of technology in higher education. I had 2 wonderful student researchers who went out and talked to these students. You can find the LSE 2020 stuff all over the internet, and I've written about it as well. What was fascinating about that, they gave us one insight that I'll think points to your question, which was they really hated, they don't mind using the technology we give them, but they'll use that technology to learn. They have their own technology that they bring to higher education, and they'll use that to live. And they hate when we use their technology and tell them how to use it. And then there's a piece of literature that talks about the notion of that being the creepy treehouse, that it's kind of like the parents creeping into the treehouse that the kids have built for themselves. And that's what social media was. And what made that really useful to address the challenge you talked about was it wasn't me presenting the findings from the student. I presented the student's own words. We filmed all of this. We showed people the words. That authenticity of that student experience was front and center when we had the discussion about the role of technology. And it was great because what it did, academics who saw that said, you know what, I'm going to stop telling them to use Facebook to do their data collection. I'm just going to say, use whatever method you feel comfortable using. Would 95% of them, we're talking back here in 2014, that's why I'm saying Facebook, but would 95% of them use Facebook? Yeah, they would, but I didn't tell them to. And that came from the authenticity of the student experience. And I've done a lot of work since then around digital stories and how students' digital stories shape exactly the challenge that you've posed. And I found it works. Sometimes it doesn't, but in the main, the student voice, the student words, the face of the student looking at the camera, talking to you, really has an impact.
That's great. Thanks very much. Thanks, Peter.
I have a question. It's
Yep.
a big question, and we're trialing this sort of big question with our guests. What's next for you?
What's next for me? So my next piece of work that I'm working on at the moment is around authentic assessment. I did some work in 2021 where I posited that, and when we came out of COVID, we would snap back to the practices of education from from 2019, for whatever that might be, peak education, which it's not, but and we did. Most universities have snapped back to pen and paper exams, and they've gone back to very much traditional ways of teaching from 2019. So that snapback's got even worse in the face of AI, and many institutions are now getting rid of all forms of assessment that could be potentially cheated on by AI, and I put that in inverted commas, and moving even more towards high stakes final exams. So I think the discussion around what authentic assessment is, and I've done a lot of thinking and rewriting about what authentic assessment is defined as. I've just published 3 blog posts on our research group blog, Diberg, diberg.blog, on what authentic assessment is. That's my next task, thinking about authentic assessment and actually try and redefine it in a way that is not about assessment of learning, but learning through assessment.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending, and have a good day if you're in the UK, and have a good evening if you're in Australia or any other time zone. Have a good whatever the day ahead is for you.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.